Get ready to have your mind blown by some history that school probably skipped over. We are talking about women who were total game changers, living lives that people around them just could not wrap their heads around. Imagine being so brilliant, so different, that society decided you were weird, dangerous, or just plain wrong. One of these women was a queen who used her single status as her greatest weapon in a world of kings. Another was a teenage girl who led armies, only to be betrayed and burned. And another, she was a philosopher in ancient times, a woman so smart that a mob, stirred by fear and ignorance, literally tore her apart. These are not fairy tales. These are the real stories of women who dared to be different, dared to be single, and dared to be way, way ahead of everyone else. Let's count them down. Number 7. Hildegard von Bingen. The woman who saw the future and wrote it all down. Picture this. It is the 1100s. That is, over 900 years ago. Most people, especially women, were not writing books, composing music, or giving advice to popes and kings, but Hildegard von Bingen was not most people. She was born in Germany, the 10th child in her family, which in those days sometimes meant you were considered a tithe to the church, a special offering. And special she was. From the age of 3, Hildegard said she experienced visions. She described seeing a brilliant light so bright it made her soul tremble, but it did not hurt her eyes. She called this light the shade of the living light, and said that through it she understood the meaning of religious texts and saw events unfolding. For a long time, she kept these visions mostly to herself, scared of what others might think. Can you imagine being a little kid and seeing things no one else did? It must have been pretty intense. When she was just 8 years old, her parents sent her to live at a monastery to be educated by a holy woman named Jutta. Hildegard became a nun, dedicating her life to religious service. She learned to read Latin, which was the language of scholars and the church, but she never considered herself a great writer in the traditional sense. She said she wrote down what the living light told her to. When Jutta died, Hildegard, then in her late 30s, was chosen to be the leader of the community of nuns. Around this time, at age 42, she had a particularly powerful vision. She said, a fiery light from heaven poured into her brain, and she was commanded to write down what she saw and heard. She was hesitant. She felt unwell. She was a woman in a world where men held almost all the authority, especially in religious matters. But a monk named Volmar, who was her secretary and friend, and her community of nuns, encouraged her. So she started writing. Her first major work was called Scivias, which is short for Scito Vias Domini. Know the ways of the Lord. It took her 10 years to complete. This book described 26 of her visions, dealing with huge topics like the creation of the world, the nature of humanity, sin, redemption, and the end of times. It was filled with incredible symbolic imagery, a cosmic egg, a figure with a sapphire head, stars falling from the sky. The book was illustrated with stunning, colorful images, possibly designed by Hildegard herself, or under her close direction. These images are as famous as her words. Now, how did the world react to a nun claiming to have divine visions and writing them down? It was a mixed bag. Some were skeptical. A woman visionary. It was unusual. But Hildegard was smart. She sought approval from the church. She wrote to Bernard of Clairvaux, a very influential churchman, and he was supportive. Eventually, Pope Eugenius Shy heard about her work. He even read parts of Scivias aloud at a church council, a synod, in Trier around 1147–1148. He gave her his official blessing to continue writing and publishing her visions. This was a huge deal. It gave her legitimacy and protection. But Hildegard was not just about visions. She was a whirlwind of activity. She wrote 2 more big books on theology and her visions, Liber Vitae Meritorum, Book of Life's Merits, and Liber Divinorum Oberum, Book of Divine Works. But wait, there is more. She wrote books on medicine and natural history, called Physica and Causae et Curae. In these, she described plants, animals, stones, and their medicinal properties. She talked about health, diet, and the human body with a kind of practical wisdom. Some of her remedies were based on the folk knowledge of the time, while others showed keen observation. She was talking about the balance of elements in the body, sort of like an early version of holistic health. And then there was her music. Hildegard composed an incredible amount of music, hymns, sequences, and antiphons. More than 70 of her compositions survive, which is more than most medieval composers we know by name. Her music is unique with soaring melodies that stretch the boundaries of the traditional church chants of her day. She even wrote a musical morality play called Ordo Virtutum, Order of the Virtues, which is like an early opera depicting the struggle for a human soul between the virtues and the devil. The devil, by the way, is the only character in the play who does not sing. He only shouts or grunts because Hildegard believed music was divine and the devil was cut off from it. As she became more famous, people wrote to her for advice: abbots, bishops, emperors, and popes. Her letters, hundreds of them, survive. She was not afraid to speak her mind even to powerful men. She called out corruption in the church. She went on preaching tours, speaking publicly, which was almost unheard of for a woman at that time. She founded her own monastery on the Rupertsberg, and later a daughter house, so her community of nuns could have more independence. This itself was a struggle. The monks at her old monastery did not want to let her and her nuns go, possibly because they benefited from the dowries and prestige Hildegard brought. She fought for it, and won. So, how was she misunderstood? Well, for starters, just being a woman with such authority and public voice was shocking to many. Some probably doubted her visions, thinking she was making them up or was mentally unstable, even though the Pope had approved them. Her outspokenness, especially when criticizing powerful church figures, could have been seen as arrogant or rebellious. Her interest in the natural world and medicine, while common in monasteries to some extent, was unusually deep and systematic for a woman of her time, and could have made some people uneasy, perhaps hinting at knowledge that was not strictly theological. She also had a major conflict near the end of her life. She allowed a young nobleman, who had been excommunicated from the church, to be buried in her monastery's cemetery because she believed he had repented before death. Church authorities were furious. They placed her monastery under interdict, which meant no music could be sung, no sacraments performed. For Hildegard, who believed music was the voice of heaven, this was devastating. She fought back, writing passionate letters defending her decision. Eventually, the interdict was lifted, just months before she died at the age of 81. Hildegard von Bingen was a nun, so she was single in the sense of being celibate and dedicated to a spiritual life outside of traditional marriage. This path allowed her the space and eventually the authority to pursue her extraordinary range of talents. If she had been married, her life would have been consumed by domestic duties and child rearing, as was the norm. Instead, she became a public figure, a respected scholar, a composer, a physician, a theologian, and a prophet, all rolled into one. She saw the world in a unique way and was not afraid to share it, even when it was difficult or dangerous. She did not just live in her time. She stretched its boundaries. Number 6. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, the nun who fought for a woman's right to know stuff. Let's jump forward a few centuries to the 1600s to colonial Mexico, then known as New Spain. Meet Juana Inés de Esba y Ramirez de Santillana, or as history better knows, her Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. If Hildegard was a polymath of the early Middle Ages, Sor Juana was the intellectual superstar of the Baroque period in the Americas. She was born around 1648 or 1651. The exact date is a bit fuzzy, near Mexico City. Her parents were not married, which could have been a social disadvantage. From a very young age, Juana was ridiculously smart. We are talking prodigy level. She learned to read at age 3 by secretly following her older sister to her lessons. She devoured every book in her grandfather's library. Legend has it that she learned Latin in just 20 lessons. She also supposedly cut her own hair as a punishment if she did not learn something as quickly as she thought she should. Talk about self-discipline. She wanted to go to the University of Mexico, but, of course, universities were for men only. She even begged her mother to let her dress as a boy to attend. Her mother said no, understandably. So Juana continued to study on her own, teaching herself everything from theology and philosophy to mathematics, astronomy, music, and poetry. When she was a teenager, her beauty and intelligence caught the attention of the viceroy's wife, who brought her to the court in Mexico City to be a lady-in-waiting. At court, her knowledge was legendary. There is a famous story that the viceroy, to test her, assembled a panel of about 40 university professors, theologians, philosophers, mathematicians, and poets to examine her. And this teenage girl, with no formal university education, reportedly answered all their questions brilliantly, leaving them amazed. Court life was not fulfilling for Juana. She had a deep desire for knowledge, and in her society, there were very few paths for a woman who wanted to dedicate her life to study. She wrote that she saw 2 main options: marriage or the convent. Marriage, for her, meant giving up her intellectual freedom. So, at around age 20 or 21, she chose to become a nun. She first joined the strict Discalced Carmelites, but found their rules too harsh and left after a few months. Then, she entered the convent of Santa Paula, of the Hieronymite order, which was more relaxed and allowed her to continue her studies. She would remain there for the rest of her life. As Sor Juana, she turned her nun's cell into a scholar's paradise. She built up a huge personal library, one of the largest in the New World at the time, with thousands of books. She had scientific instruments, musical instruments. She wrote poetry, love poems, religious poems, philosophical poems. She wrote plays, both religious and secular comedies of manners. She wrote essays and carols. Her work was witty, intelligent, and often explored complex themes like love, jealousy, reason, faith, and the hypocrisy of men. One of her most famous poems is Hombre Neos, or Foolish Men, where she calls out the double standards men apply to women. For example, she points out how men criticize women for being too easy if they give in, and too cruel if they resist. It was a bold and sharp critique for its time, and it still resonates. For many years, Sor Juana enjoyed the support of powerful patrons, including viceroys and their wives. Her works were published in Spain and celebrated. She was known as the 10th Muse, or the Phoenix of Mexico. But her intellectual pursuits and her outspokenness eventually got her into trouble with church authorities. Turning point came around 1690. Sor Juana wrote a private critique of a 40-year-old sermon by a famous Portuguese Jesuit preacher. A friend, the Bishop of Puebla, published her critique without her permission under the title Carta Atenagarica, letter worthy of Athena. But the bishop also published his own letter under the female pseudonym Sor Filotea de la Cruz, in which he praised Sor Juana's intellect but criticized her for focusing on secular studies instead of purely religious ones. He basically told her that a woman, especially a nun, should not be writing about such worldly topics or engaging in theological debate with men. This was a public rebuke. Sor Juana responded with one of her most brilliant and important works, Respuesta a Sor Filotea de la Cruz. Reply to Sor Filotea. This respuesta is a passionate defense of a woman's right to education and intellectual pursuits. She argued that women were perfectly capable of learning, and that studying secular subjects could actually enhance understanding of theology. She cited many learned women from history, from the Bible and classical antiquity, to support her case. She detailed her own lifelong, unstoppable thirst for knowledge. It was a masterpiece of rhetoric and a powerful early feminist statement. The pressure was mounting. Her patrons, the Viceroy and his wife, had returned to Spain. The new Archbishop of Mexico, Francisco de Aguirre Isegas, was a very conservative and misogynistic figure who disapproved of Sor Juana's activities, her writing, and even things like plays and secular music within convents. He believed women should be silent and submissive. Around 1693 or 1694, Sor Juana seems to have given in to the pressure. She sold her vast library, her musical and scientific instruments. The money reportedly went to charity. She signed documents reaffirming her faith and renouncing her studies, writing in her own blood, I, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, the worst in the world. It is a heartbreaking moment for anyone who admires her spirit. Why did she do it? Was she truly repentant? Was she forced? Was it a strategic retreat? Historians still debate this. Some facts suggest intense external pressure. She was a nun, bound by obedience. The church was incredibly powerful. Defying it openly could have had severe consequences. Just a couple of years later, in 1695, a plague swept through Mexico City. Sor Juana, nursing her sister nuns, fell ill and died. She was only in her mid-40s. Sor Juana was misunderstood because she was a woman who dared to be an intellectual giant in a world that told women to be quiet and stick to domestic or purely devotional roles. Her intelligence was seen by some as unnatural or even dangerous for a woman. Her defense of women's education was revolutionary for her time and place. Choosing the convent over marriage was her way of trying to carve out a space for her intellectual life, making her single in the societal sense that she was not defined by a husband or traditional family. But even in the convent, the world's expectations and limitations eventually caught up with her. She was ahead of her time in her arguments for women's intellectual equality, and it took centuries for society to even begin to catch up with her vision. Number 5. Florence Nightingale. The Lady with the Lamp was actually a dated geik who fought the army. When you hear the name Florence Nightingale, you probably picture a gentle, kind woman in a nurse's cap, holding a lamp calmly tending to wounded soldiers. And yes, she did that. But that image, the Lady with the Lamp, only scratches the surface of who Florence Nightingale was and why she was so often misunderstood. She was not just a compassionate caroler. She was a fierce, determined reformer, a brilliant statistician, and a woman who battled bureaucracy and prejudice to change healthcare forever. Born in 1820 in Florence, Italy, hence her name, into a wealthy, well-connected British family, Florence was expected to live a life of leisure, marry well, and run a household. That was the path for upper-class women in Victorian England. But Florence felt a different calling. From a young age, she believed God had called her to service, though she was not sure exactly what that meant at first. She was highly educated for a woman of her time, taught by her father in Greek, Latin, mathematics, history, and philosophy. As she grew older, she developed a keen interest in social issues and the suffering of the poor. She became convinced that her mission was to become a nurse. Now, you have to understand what nursing was like in the mid-1800s. It was not a respected profession. Hospitals were often dirty, chaotic places. Nurses were usually untrained, often from lower classes, and sometimes had reputations for drunkenness and promiscuity. For a wealthy, educated woman like Florence to want to be a nurse was scandalous to her family. They were horrified. Her mother and sister tried everything to dissuade her. It caused years of painful conflict. They wanted her to marry, to attend parties, to fit in. But Florence refused. She turned down multiple marriage proposals, believing that marriage would trap her and prevent her from pursuing her calling. She famously wrote that she craved a profession, a trade, a definite object. She secretly studied nursing reports and public health documents. She visited hospitals whenever she could. Eventually, in her early 30s, she managed to get some formal nursing training in Germany at Kaiserswerth, a pioneering institution. Then she took a position as superintendent of a hospital for gentlewomen in London. She was good at it. She improved hygiene, organized the hospital efficiently. Then, in 1853, the Crimean War broke out. Britain, France, and Turkey were fighting Russia. Reports started trickling back to Britain about the horrific conditions for wounded soldiers. They were dying in droves, not just from battle wounds, but from diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhus in overcrowded, unsanitary hospitals. There was a public outcry. Sidney Herbert, the Secretary at War, and a friend of Florence's family asked her to lead a team of nurses to the military hospital in Scutari, Turkey. This was unprecedented. Women, especially ladies, did not go to war zones. But Florence, then 34, assembled a group of 38 nurses and set off. What she found at Scutari was worse than anyone imagined. The hospital was built over a massive cesspool. Rats scurried through the wards. Wounded men lay on filthy straw, often in their own excrement, without clean water, decent food, or basic medical supplies. Doctors were overworked and initially very resistant to these female nurses, seeing them as an intrusion. Florence did not just start by attending to individual patients, though she did that tirelessly, famously making rounds at night with her lamp, which gave her that iconic image. She immediately saw the bigger picture. This was a systems problem. She got to work with ferocious energy. She organized the nurses. She got the wards cleaned. She set up a laundry. She sourced clean bedding and supplies. She improved sanitation and ventilation. She established a kitchen to provide better food. She wrote letters, reports, pleaded for supplies and support. She was an administrator, a logistician, a whirlwind of practical action. And here is where the data geek part comes in. Florence was a brilliant statistician. She meticulously collected data on mortality rates, causes of death, and the impact of her sanitary reforms. She realized that far more soldiers were dying from disease than from their wounds, something like 10 times more. She used her statistics to prove that improved hygiene and care dramatically reduced death rates. In one hospital, the mortality rate dropped from 42% to 2% under her reforms. She developed new ways to present statistical data visually, most famously the polar area diagram, or Nightingale Rose diagram, which was like a pie chart but showed cyclical patterns. These diagrams powerfully illustrated how many deaths were preventable. She was a pioneer in using data to drive policy change in healthcare. When she returned to England after the war in 1856, she was a national hero, but she avoided public attention. She knew her work was not done. She used her fame and her powerful connections. She corresponded with Queen Victoria and government ministers to push for massive reforms in military healthcare and then in civilian hospitals. She wrote an 830-page report, Notes on Matters Affecting the Health, Efficiency, and Hospital Administration of the British Army, packed with statistics which led to the formation of a royal commission. She then wrote Notes on Hospitals, which became a standard textbook on hospital design and management, emphasizing sanitation and patient well-being. In 1860, she established the Nightingale Training School for Nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, the first secular nursing school in the world. This professionalized nursing, turning it into a respected career for women. So, how was this dynamo misunderstood? Well, the popular image of the lady with the lamp made her seem soft, gentle, almost saintly. But in reality, Florence Nightingale was tough, demanding, single-minded, and sometimes incredibly difficult to work with. She had a fiery temper. She could be ruthless in pursuing her goals. She drove herself and others relentlessly. Some doctors and officials resented her, a woman telling them how to run their hospitals and manage military affairs. They saw her as an interfering busybody. Even her dedication to her work was misunderstood. She spent much of the rest of her life after Crimea as a recluse, often confined to her bed by illness, possibly brucellosis, contracted in Crimea, and chronic fatigue. Yet, from her sickbed, she continued to work tirelessly, writing thousands of letters, reports, and books, campaigning for health reform in Britain and even in India. Some thought she was exaggerating her illness to get attention or to manipulate people, but it seems she genuinely suffered, yet refused to let it stop her work. Her choice to remain single was also a source of commentary. In a society where a woman's role was wife and mother, her intense dedication to her career was unusual. She saw her work as a divine calling that required her complete focus, something she felt marriage would compromise. She once wrote, "I have no martyr spirit. I am not ready to be a burnt offering, but I am more and more convinced that a woman has nothing but too much choice of that sort, should she wish to make herself a sacrifice." She chose her path, and it was a lonely one at times, but one that changed the world. Florence Nightingale was not just a nurse. She was a scientist, a manager, a political lobbyist, and a visionary. She was ahead of her time in her understanding of sanitation, her use of statistics, and her fight to create a professional nursing corps. People wanted to see a gentle angel of mercy, but she was a warrior for health, and her battles were often fought far from the bedside, in the halls of power and in the pages of groundring reports. Number 4. Sappho, the poet whose words burned so bright they tried to snuff them out. Let's travel way, way back in time to ancient Greece, around 600 years before Common Era. On the island of Lesbos, in the Aegean Sea, lived a woman named Sappho. We know her name, and we know she was a poet, perhaps one of the greatest lyric poets of all time. But so much about her life is shrouded in mystery, rumor, and centuries of other people's interpretations. This has made her one of history's most profoundly misunderstood figures. What are the facts we have? Sappho was born into an aristocratic family on Lesbos. She seems to have been married to a wealthy man named Cerkyllus of Andros, and they may have had a daughter named Clys, whom Sappho mentions lovingly in one of her surviving fragments of poetry. She was a lyric poet, meaning she wrote poems that were often sung to the accompaniment of a lyre, hence the word lyric. Her poetry was intensely personal, focusing on themes of love, desire, beauty, jealousy, and the everyday lives and relationships of a community of women. This community is key. Sappho seems to have been the leader or central figure of a group of women and girls, perhaps a kind of informal school or association, dedicated to the cult of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and the Muses, the goddesses of the arts. Here, they would learn poetry, music, dance, and cultivate beauty and grace. Much of Sappho's poetry appears to have been written for, or about, the women in this circle. Her poetry was incredibly innovative. Before Sappho, much of Greek poetry was epic, like Homer's tales of war and heroic deeds. Sappho's work was different. It was intimate, emotional, and direct. She wrote in her local Aeolic Greek dialect, and she developed a specific poetic meter, a rhythm, called the Sapphic stanza, which is named after her. Ancient critics, mostly men, showered her with praise. Plato supposedly called her the 10th muse. Others called her the poetess, just as Homer was called the poet. Her work was so popular that it was collected into 9 books in the Great Library of Alexandria, but tragically most of this has been lost. What survives today are mostly fragments, a few complete poems, many single lines or just a few words, quoted by later ancient writers or discovered on scraps of papyrus in Egypt. But even these fragments are powerful. They speak of intense love and longing, often directed towards other women. For example, in one famous poem, often called Fragment 31, she describes the overwhelming physical sensations of seeing a beloved woman talking with a man. Her heart pounds, she cannot speak. A thin flame runs under her skin. She trembles and turns pale. It is a visceral depiction of love and jealousy. So, how did Sappho become so misunderstood? Well, it started in antiquity and has continued for over 2 millennia. The main point of confusion and controversy has been her sexuality. Because her poems often expressed passionate love for other women, later writers, especially comic playwrights in Athens centuries after her death, started to create a sensationalized image of her. They portrayed her as overly promiscuous or as a sexually deviant figure. The term lesbian, meaning a woman who loves women, comes from the name of her island, Lesbos, precisely because of Sappho and her circle. On the other hand, some later interpreters, particularly in more prudish Victorian times, tried to clean up her image. They argued that her love for women was purely platonic, like a teacher for her students, or that the poems were not autobiographical but just artistic expressions. They tried to make her fit conventional ideas of female virtue. The truth is, we do not know the exact nature of the relationships within Sappho's circle with certainty. Ancient Greek attitudes towards same-sex relationships were different from modern ones and varied across different city-states and time periods. For women, the historical record is much scarcer than for men. What is clear from her poetry is that deep, passionate, emotional, and perhaps physical bonds between women were central to her world and her art. To deny this is to misunderstand her poetry. Another layer of misunderstanding comes from the legends that grew up around her. The most famous is the story that she fell in love with a young ferryman named Phaon, and when he rejected her, she threw herself off a cliff into the sea and died. This story is almost certainly a later invention, possibly from those Athenian comic playwrights. There is no historical evidence for it, and it conveniently turns the poet of female love into a victim of unrequited heterosexual passion. It served to domesticate her image, to make her less challenging to patriarchal norms. The fact that so little of her work survives has also contributed to misunderstandings, as it leaves more room for speculation. Why did her 9 books disappear? Some have blamed deliberate destruction by later morally scandalized Christian authorities, who found her themes, particularly the homoerotic ones, unacceptable. While direct evidence of large-scale, systematic burning of her books is hard to pinpoint, it is plausible that her work was less frequently copied and preserved in later centuries due to changing moral codes, leading to its gradual loss. What we have is precious, like shards of a magnificent, shattered vase. Sappho was not single in the modern sense of never marrying, as mentioned. She likely was married and had a child. However, her primary emotional world, as reflected in her poetry, seems to have been centered on women. Her life and work existed largely outside the male-dominated public sphere of ancient Greece. She created a space for female community, female artistry, and the expression of female desire. This was radically ahead of its time. In a world where women's voices were largely silenced or ignored, Sappho sang out with clarity, passion, and brilliance. Her very existence as a celebrated female poet in the ancient world was extraordinary. Her focus on the intimate, emotional lives of women was groundbreaking. The attempts to define her, to label her, to either condemn her or xanthamize her, have often missed the power and beauty of her actual words. She remains an icon for many, a symbol of female creativity and love between women, precisely because she dared to articulate experiences that were, and in some ways still are, pushed to the margins. The misunderstanding of Sappho is a long story of people trying to fit a complex, brilliant woman into simpler, more convenient boxes. Number 3. Hypatia of Alexandria. The philosopher woman, so smart they tore her apart. Imagine a city that is the intellectual capital of the world, a vibrant hub of learning, libraries, and diverse ideas. This was Alexandria in Egypt, in the late 300s and early 400s Common Era. And in this city, a woman named Hypatia stood out as one of its brightest stars, a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer. She was admired for her intellect, her teaching, and her wisdom. She was also brutally murdered by a mob. Her story is a chilling example of how being a woman ahead of her time, especially in a period of intense political and religious turmoil, could be incredibly dangerous. Hypatia was born around 350 or 370 CE. Her father was Theon of Alexandria, a well-known mathematician and astronomer associated with the Great Motion or Museum of Alexandria, which included the legendary library. Theon educated his daughter himself, and it seems he passed on his passion for knowledge. Hypatia quickly surpassed many of her contemporaries in intellectual prowess. She became a renowned teacher of philosophy, specifically Neoplatonism, which was a school of thought that blended Plato's ideas with other mystical and philosophical traditions. She taught from her home and in public lecture halls. Her students were a diverse group: Christians, pagans, followers of traditional Greco-Roman religions, and people from different social classes and parts of the Roman Empire. Many of them were influential young men who would go on to hold important positions in government and the church. Her lectures were not just on philosophy. She also taught mathematics and astronomy. She was known for her eloquence and her ability to explain complex ideas clearly. Ancient sources, though some written much later, describe her as a monarch and virtuous figure. She chose a life of celibacy and dedication to scholarship, never marrying. This was unusual for a woman of her status, who would typically be expected to marry and have children to secure family alliances and property. By remaining single, she maintained her independence and her ability to pursue her intellectual life without the constraints of traditional female roles. Hypatia was not just a teacher, she was also a scholar in her own right. While none of her original writings survive, we know from contemporary and later accounts that she wrote commentaries on important mathematical and astronomical texts, such as Diophantus's Arithmetica, a foundational work in algebra, and Apollonius of Perga's conics on conic sections like ellipses and parabolas. She may have collaborated with her father on his works, for example, his commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, a hugely influential treatise on astronomy. There are also reports that she was skilled in practical technology, designing scientific instruments like astrolabes, used to measure the positions of stars, and hydroscopes, used to measure the density of liquids. So she was brilliant, respected, and influential. What went wrong? Alexandria, in Hypatia's time, was a powder keg. The Roman Empire was officially becoming Christian. Paganism was being suppressed. There were fierce rivalries and tensions between different groups, pagans, Jews, and various Christian factions. Political power was also at play, with conflicts between the Roman imperial prefect, Orestes, who was the civil governor of Alexandria, and Cyril, the powerful and often aggressive Christian patriarch, or archbishop, of Alexandria. Hypatia, though a pagan philosopher herself, had good relationships with people from different religious backgrounds. She was respected for her intellectual neutrality and her wisdom. Orestes, the prefect, was one of her close friends and admirers. He often sought her advice. This association seems to have been her undoing. Cyril, the patriarch, was consolidating his power and was known for his hostility towards pagans, Jews, and any Christian groups he considered heretical. He had a large and sometimes violent following among the monks and the general Christian populace of Alexandria. Tensions between Orestes and Cyril escalated dramatically. There were riots and clashes in the city. In this volatile atmosphere, Hypatia became a target. Rumors started to spread among some of Cyril's more extreme followers. They claimed that Hypatia, with her pagan philosophy and her influence over Orestes, was preventing a reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril. Some saw her as a sorceress, using black magic to enchant the prefect. She was a prominent pagan woman, a symbol of an old intellectual tradition that some Christians saw as a threat to their faith, and her independence and public role also made her stand out, challenging traditional gender norms. In March of 415 CE, the unthinkable happened. A mob of Christian fanatics, reportedly led by a church reader named Peter, ambushed Hypatia as she was returning home in her chariot. They dragged her from her chariot, took her to a church called the Caesareum, stripped her naked, and then murdered her. The ancient accounts say they used ostraca pieces of pottery shards or roofing tiles to scrape the flesh from her bones while she was still alive. Then they dismembered her body and burned her remains. It was an act of horrific brutality. The murder of Hypatia sent shockwaves through the intellectual world. It was seen as a dark day for philosophy and learning. So, how was she misunderstood? In her lifetime, by that mob, she was catastrophically misunderstood as a malevolent political actor or a dangerous witch, rather than the respected philosopher and teacher she was. Her knowledge and influence attributes celebrated in men were twisted into something sinister in her. A woman, her paganism, in a time of rising Christian dominance, made her vulnerable. Her close relationship with Orestes, the political leader, put her in the crossfire of a power struggle. Historically, there have been different interpretations of her murder. Some have blamed Cyril directly, though direct proof of his ordering the murder is lacking. However, his fiery rhetoric against pagans and his political enemies certainly created an environment where such an atrocity could occur. Others see it more as a result of mob violence fueled by political and religious fanaticism, with Hypatia as a convenient scapegoat. Her singleness was part of her identity as a dedicated philosopher. She chose the life of the mind over a conventional domestic life. This independence, while allowing her to flourish intellectually, also made her stand out and perhaps more vulnerable in a society that had strict roles for women. Hypatia was ahead of her time, not just as a female intellectual in a male-dominated field, but also in her apparent efforts to foster dialogue and learning across different philosophical and religious traditions, at least among her students. Her tragic death is often seen as a symbol of the end of classical antiquity's intellectual freedom and the rise of a more dogmatic era, though history is, of course, more complex than that. Nevertheless, her story remains a powerful reminder of the courage it took for a woman to pursue knowledge and a public intellectual life in a world not ready for her, and the terrible price she paid for it. Number 2. Joan of Arc. The teenage girl who led an army and was called a saint and a witch. Let us journey to 15th century France, a country torn apart by war. The 100 Years' War between France and England had been dragging on for generations. Large parts of France were occupied by the English and their Burgundian allies. The French heir to the throne, the Dauphin Charles, was uncrowned, and his cause seemed hopeless. And then, onto this desperate stage, walked a teenage peasant girl from a small village named Domremy. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc. Her story is one of the most astonishing and debated in history. Joan was born around 1412. She was a devoutly religious girl, but otherwise unremarkable in her early years. She could not read or write. But starting around the age of 13, Joan said she began to experience visions and hear voices. Voices she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices, she claimed, told her she had a divine mission to save France, to drive out the English, and to see the Dauphin Charles crowned as king in Reims Cathedral, the traditional site of French coronations. Imagine that, a young, uneducated girl from the countryside, claiming God, was talking to her and had given her this monumental task. Sounds unbelievable, and for many at the time it was. But Joan was persistent. When she was about 16 or 17, in 1429, she managed to convince Robert de Baudricourt, the commander of the nearby royal garrison at Vaucouleurs, to give her an escort to travel to Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles was holding his court. This was no small feat. She had to cut her hair short and dress in men's clothing for the dangerous journey through enemy territory. When she arrived at Chinon, Charles was understandably skeptical. A teenage girl claiming to be sent by God. To test her legend, says Charles disguised himself among his courtiers. But Joan, supposedly guided by her voices, walked straight to him and identified him. She told him things that convinced him she was genuine, possibly a secret prayer he had made. After an examination by theologians who found nothing heretical in her claims, Charles, in his desperation, decided to take a chance on her. What did he have to lose? He gave her a suit of armor, a banner with the names of Jesus and Mary, and a small army. And then, the miracle, or at least the incredible, began. In May 1429, Joan led the French army to the besieged city of Orleans. The English had been trying to capture Orleans for months, and its fall would have been a devastating blow to the French cause. Joan, with her inspiring presence and unwavering conviction, galvanized the demoralized French soldiers. She rode at their head, carrying her banner, urging them on. Despite being wounded by an arrow, she returned to the fight. Within days of her arrival, the siege of Orleans was broken. English retreated. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. This victory at Orleans was a turning point in the war and in Joan's story. She became known as the Maid of Orleans. More victories followed as she led the army through the Loire Valley. Her presence seemed to bring courage and success to the French forces. Her ultimate goal was to get Charles to Reims for his coronation. After clearing the path, Charles was crowned King Charles V of France in Reims Cathedral in July 1429, with Joan standing beside him. She had accomplished a major part of her mission, but her story takes a dark turn. After the coronation, some at court grew jealous of her influence, or perhaps wary of her power. Military campaigns became less successful. In May 1430, during an attempt to relieve the siege of Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian soldiers who were allied with the English. King Charles V, for reasons still debated by historians, perhaps lack of funds, political maneuvering, or indifference, made no significant effort to rescue her or ransom her. The Burgundians eventually sold her to the English. The English wanted to discredit Joan and, by extension, King Charles V, whose coronation she had made possible. If they could prove Joan was a witch or a heretic, it would undermine the legitimacy of Charles's kingship. They put her on trial for heresy in Rouen, a city under English control. The trial was politically motivated and deeply flawed. It was run by pro-English churchmen, led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon. Joan, still a teenager, uneducated in law or theology, faced a panel of learned accusers. She was interrogated for months. Trial records which survive show her to be remarkably brave, witty, and steadfast in her claims. She insisted her voices were from God. She defended her wearing of men's clothes, saying her voices commanded it, and it was necessary for her safety among soldiers. She was misunderstood and misrepresented at every turn during this trial. Her divine voices were twisted into demonic communications. Her piety was questioned. Her unconventional behavior, a woman leading an army wearing men's clothes, was used against her as evidence of her deviance from God's will and social norms. They tried to trap her with theological questions. For example, they asked if she knew she was in God's grace. If she said yes, it was presumption. If she said no, it was an admission of sin. She famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Eventually, under immense pressure, exhausted and possibly threatened with torture, Joan signed an abjuration, a document confessing to some errors and promising to wear women's clothes. Her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. However, a few days later she was found wearing men's clothes again. Why? Some accounts say her women's clothes were taken from her, or she was tricked or forced into it. Others suggest she recanted her abjuration, perhaps feeling she had betrayed her voices. Whatever the reason, this relapse into heresy, as her judges saw it, sealed her fate. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc, about 19 years old, was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She asked for a cross to be held before her as she died, and she called out the name of Jesus. Joan was single, celibate, dedicated to her divine mission. This was part of her identity as the Maid. Marriage was never part of her plan, as revealed by her voices. Her unique path was entirely outside the normal expectations for a woman of her time. How was she misunderstood? Well, to her enemies, she was a heretic, a witch, a tool of the devil, or at best, a deluded madwoman. Her wearing of men's clothes was seen as an abomination. Her military success was attributed to sorcery. Even among her allies, some may have seen her as a useful mascot or a political pawn rather than truly understanding or believing in her divine inspiration. Years later, after the French had finally won the war, a war Joan had helped turn the tide of, King Charles V ordered a retrial, or nullification trial, to examine the legality of her condemnation. In 1456, Joan was officially declared innocent. Her original trial was found to be unjust and deceitful. Much later, in 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Roman Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. So from heretic and witch to national hero and saint, Joan of Arc's image has undergone a massive transformation. She was ahead of her time in her courage, her conviction, and her defiance of gender roles. She was a peasant girl who commanded armies, advised a king, and changed the course of a war, all driven by what she believed to be divine guidance. Whether one believes in her visions or not, her impact is undeniable. She was misunderstood by those who could not comprehend a woman, especially a young peasant, wielding such power and influence, and by those who sought to destroy her for political gain. Her story continues to fascinate and inspire, a testament to an extraordinary individual who dared to follow her own path, however unbelievable it seemed. Number 1. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who ruled alone and made England a superpower. Topping our list is a woman who was born to be a queen but was never expected to rule. A woman who turned her single status from a perceived weakness into a formidable political weapon, and who presided over one of the most glorious eras in English history. We are talking about Queen Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth was born in 1533, the daughter of King Henry VI and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her birth was a disappointment to Henry, who desperately wanted a male heir. When Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was accused of treason and adultery and beheaded on Henry's orders. Elizabeth herself was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession for a time. Can you imagine the kind of childhood that creates uncertainty, danger, and the constant need to be careful? She received an excellent education, becoming fluent in several languages, including Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She was intelligent, sharp-witted, and learned early on the arts of survival in a treacherous Tudor court. After her father's death, she navigated the reigns of her younger half-brother Edward VI, and then her staunchly Catholic older half-sister, Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth, a Protestant, was viewed with suspicion. She was even imprisoned in the Tower of London for a time, accused of involvement in a rebellion. She narrowly avoided execution. These early experiences taught her caution, resilience, and political cunning. In 1558, at the age of 25, Elizabeth became Queen of England upon Mary's death. England was in a troubled state, religiously divided between Catholics and Protestants, economically weak, and at risk from powerful neighbors like Spain and France. Many doubted that a young, unmarried woman could rule effectively. The pressure on her to marry and produce an heir was immense from day one. Parliament, her counselors, everyone urged her to find a husband. King, they believed, would provide stability and strength. But Elizabeth had other ideas. For decades, she skillfully played the international marriage game. She entertained proposals from various European princes and kings. Philip II of Spain, her former brother-in-law, archdukes from Austria, French princes, each potential match was a diplomatic tool. She would encourage one suitor, then another, keeping them all dangling, using the prospect of her hand in marriage to forge alliances, avert threats, or gain advantages for England. It was a masterful display of political maneuvering. She famously told Parliament, "I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England." Why did she never marry? Historians have debated this for centuries. Was it a calculated political strategy? Did her traumatic early experiences with her father's disastrous marriages and her mother's fate put her off? Was she afraid of losing her power to a husband, as was common for queens regnant who married? Perhaps it was a combination of all these things. She saw how her sister Mary's marriage to Philip I of Spain had been unpopular and dragged England into Spain's wars. Elizabeth was determined to put England's interests first. By remaining single, she remained solely in control. This decision to remain unmarried was one of the primary ways. She was misunderstood. In the patriarchal world, a queen without a king, a woman ruling in her own right without a male consort, was an anomaly. Many of her contemporaries, especially men, could not fathom it. They saw her as indecisive, fickle, or emotionally unstable because she would not commit to a husband. Foreign ambassadors wrote dispatches trying to analyze her motives, often getting it wrong. Some spread rumors about her supposed lovers, like her childhood friend Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. While she clearly had deep affection for Dudley, and their relationship was a subject of much gossip and speculation, she never married him or anyone else. She cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, married to her kingdom and her people. This image became a powerful part of her mystique and her propaganda. Elizabeth was ahead of her time in her approach to rule. She was a pragmatic and skilled politician. She established a religious settlement, the Elizabethan settlement, which tried to find a middle way between extreme Protestantism and Catholicism, bringing a degree of religious stability to England after years of turmoil. It did not please everyone, but it largely worked. She was cautious in foreign policy, preferring diplomacy and avoiding costly wars when possible, though she was not afraid to act decisively when necessary, as seen in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. That victory against the Spanish Armada was a defining moment of her reign. Spain, under Philip I, was the superpower of the age, and the Armada was a massive fleet sent to invade England and depose Elizabeth. England was the underdog. But a combination of English naval skill, stormy weather, the Protestant wind as some called it, and Spanish miscalculations led to a famous English victory. Elizabeth famously rallied her troops at Tilbury, dressed in armor, saying, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." This speech cemented her image as a courageous and beloved leader. Her reign, lasting nearly 45 years, is often called the Golden Age of England. It was a time of relative peace and prosperity, a flourishing of arts and literature. Think Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, and growing national pride and confidence. Exploration and trade expanded, laying the foundations for England's future global power. But it was not all smooth sailing. There were plots against her life, rebellions, economic challenges, and the ongoing issue of succession since she had no direct heir. The execution of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic claimant to the English throne and a focal point for plots against Elizabeth, was a particularly difficult decision for her. Elizabeth was misunderstood because she defied expectations of what a queen and a woman should be. Her refusal to marry was baffling to many. Her political shrewdness was sometimes misinterpreted as indecision or feminine weakness. Her careful balancing act in religious matters was seen as insufficient by both zealous Catholics and radical Protestants. Her very success as a female ruler in a man's world was a challenge to the established order. She used her singleness not as a liability, but as a source of power and mystique. She controlled her own image masterfully, presenting herself as Gloriana Astrea, the Virgin Goddess of Justice, or the Mother of her people. She was a complex, intelligent, and often ruthless ruler who put her country first. She was intensely private about her personal feelings, which only added to the speculation and misunderstanding surrounding her. When she died in 1603, she left behind a stronger, more confident England. She had proven that a woman could rule as effectively, if not more so, than any king. She was ahead of her time in her ability to command loyalty, navigate treacherous political waters, and embody national unity, all while constantly battling the perceptions and limitations placed on her as a woman and as a single ruler. Her reign showed that singleness for a woman in power could be a strategic choice, a path to autonomy, and an emblem of unique dedication to her realm. She was truly a queen who did it her way.